women find it difficult to compete with men in general reporting jobs. So girls who want to be successful in journalism should prepare for work in the special women's departments.
Journalism and a woman's place in it has changed over the past 4 decades. Former LA Times Washington correspondent Janet Hook can attest to that. She covered Washington for 40 years, and she joined us with a review of a new book by Brooke Kroger called Undaunted: How Women Changed American Journalism. Janet, it is so great to see you again. Welcome back.
Great to see you too, Lisa.
Tell us about this book.
Well, it's a very ambitious book. It's basically a wall-to-wall history of women in journalism, starting back in about the 1840s, which is sort of the dawn of mass media, and bringing it right up to today. And it's a pretty comprehensive catalog of women who have managed to succeed in journalism, even when male domination was really quite imposing, and sort of a catalog of the obstacles that women faced, how they succeeded in spite of odds. And to be honest with you, the most remarkable thing to me when I was reading it was how very recently it was that women even approached parity in journalism. It parallels a lot of other developments in the American economy and society, but this is our business.
The book highlights the lives and careers of a number of women. Could you tell us the ones that stuck with you?
Well, there were several women who their stories really stuck with me because they were really accomplished, and yet they still faced all kinds of degrading forms of treatment. At the very beginning of this history, we hear the story of Margaret Fuller, a very renowned journalist. She ended up being the first editor of a journal created by Ralph Waldo Emerson, no less. So she was really respected and accomplished, and yet at the time, women weren't allowed to have their name in print, so she had to sign her columns with an asterisk or just the initial F. It just wasn't proper to have your name in print unless it was your wedding announcement. Another woman who really struck me was Anne O'Hara McCormick, who I'd really never heard of. But as it turns out, she was the first woman to be named to the New York Times editorial board. And she, as a stringer for the paper, before she was actually on the payroll, interviewed Mussolini and Hitler. This was in the 1920s and 30s, incredibly accomplished just as a stringer. And even with all of that, it took 14 years for the New York Times to actually put her on the payroll. What does it take to get recognition in those days? Quite a lot of work and a lot of scoops.
She includes in this book war correspondents.
Some of the war correspondents you have probably heard of, like Martha Gellhorn, really distinguished war correspondent. There were also foreign correspondents like Flora Lewis, who went on to become a distinguished columnist on foreign policy. But during World War II, there was this interesting constraint on women, is that they were not allowed to go to the front lines of battle, where men thought all the action was. Well, a lot of women managed to turn this liability into an asset, pursuing a whole different line of reporting on war, which was the story on the home front, or articles about how war has impacted the everyday lives of people in the countries where the wars are being fought. So in some ways, it was a real obstacle to women adequately covering the war, but they found new ways to do it that I think actually now is kind of a standard feature of most war coverage.
I wonder, Janet, as you were reading the book, did you have time to reflect on your own career?
Oh, sure. I kind of, as I was plotting through the many, many, many decades that are covered in this book, when it got to the part where, oh, I was there, it reminded me of a lot of the things that I went through.
This is the first time in more than a decade that the Democrats are going to be having a leadership contest where they're going to be thinking about and debating about what kind of leader they want.
So I came to Washington to become a correspondent here in 1979. And at that point, I was kind of part of a transition generation of women in journalism, because it was really in the early 70s that some of the most important legal battles were fought and precedents were set. So by the time I came to Washington, there was an expectation that women would have equal opportunities in journalism. Now, the reality was very slow in catching up to the legal status we had. Women were still very outnumbered, especially on prestige beats like the White House or the Pentagon, and we were paid less.
Mm.
So, and even as recently as 1995, when I was first hired to the Los Angeles Times Washington bureau, it was a big, robust bureau with 35 reporting staff members, and only 7 of them were women.
I remember the anniversary of NPR, and you heard Nina Totenberg talking about the reason there's so many women at NPR is because they were cheap. And when NPR was founded, it was all they could afford. And look what they are now. You know, as we look back on these decades of journalism covered in the book, there's sadness because even though finally there is some parity, some success, equality in our newsroom, the business model of traditional journalism is in crisis. And we've seen recent layoffs here at our own paper.
Yeah, it's a historic irony that women finally get a chance to run the show just as the show is really running off the rails. I mean, you might say that women are better equipped to manage in a crisis like this if they bring a kind of empathy that men might not. But I do feel like it's a little bit of a not a setup for failure for women, but it just seems really ironic that this is when we finally get our time to run the show.
Janet Hook reviewing Undaunted. Thank you so much, Janet. It's so good to see you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Coming up, are you ready to sleep in a pod to save a little money? We talked to the reporter who slept in one of these box-like beds when LA Times Today returns.